Porsche, the German automotive manufacturer known for high speeds, big downforce, and being an absolute joy to drive. Would you believe it if I told you that they almost died? Well, in the early 90s, they were well on their way out, and in today's video, we're going to look at that story of how Porsche almost died and how this car saved Porsche. Let's go! So, the Boxster. How did it save Porsche? Well, before we look at that, we need to look at where Porsche was in the late 80s and early 90s. Needless to say, they were in a bit of a pickle. They had 3 cars in their sales lineup. The 911, which was basically the same car they sold in the 60s when the 911's life began. At this point, this car was 28 years old. Let me put this into perspective for you. People get mad at the Nissan GTR, the R35, for having a production run of 13 years. The 911 was twice that old. Porsche had a bit of an issue on their hands. They had an outdated platform with a car that people liked, but that was really starting to show its age. The other 2 cars in their lineup were the 968, which was nearing 20 years old, and the 928, which was 18 years old. This itself isn't great, but at least would be forgivable if the cars were cheap to produce. What's that you say? They're expensive to produce? Yeah, they're really expensive to produce. So expensive, in fact, that they were literally losing money on their cars. Well, that's not good. No, in fact, it's really, really bad. Indeed. So basically, they're hemorrhaging money and just watering a bunch of dead plants. Yeah, basically. So to solve this and to try and make more money, Porsche went to a consulting firm based in Japan. Now, Japan at this time was the king of the car market. All of the 90s JDM cars came from Japan in this era. This was the time to be a Japanese car manufacturer. And Porsche knew this, so they took their issues to this Japanese consulting firm. They said, drop the 928 and the 968, because those cars were nothing but literal holes in their pockets. After some contemplation, Porsche said fine and canceled the cars. This consulting firm then advised Porsche to build all of their cars on the same platform. Yes, including the 911. But notice what I said there, build all of their cars. That means that Porsche had to build a variety of cars, not just their 911. So, even though it sounded sacrilegious to build their entire lineup on the 911's platform, Porsche had to do it. This is when the development of the star of our video and the savior of Porsche started. The year is 1991, and Porsche, like I said a second ago, started designing their next car, the Boxster. They wanted a small 2-seat roadster for the US. They focused on the US because that was the market that they hadn't quite captured. See, Mazda and BMW had cars like the Z1 and the MX-5. Porsche, on the other hand, was nowhere to be found. So they called on this man, Grant Larson, to design the car that they needed. He had very little experience thus far, but Porsche saw talent in him and decided to put their faith in this man to save their company. Porsche gave Larson complete freedom over the body of the car, with the one rule being it needs to kind of look like a Porsche. So, with nothing but a pen and some paper as his weapons, he got to work. He later reflected that all drafts were produced as 2D drawings on paper, not like on the screens that they design them on today. So this Porsche was designed completely by hand, no computer assistance at all. So that's kind of a fun fact. Anyway, after getting the basic drawings done, they called on one Peter Mueller, an expert in clay, to help bring a 3D model of the soon-to-be Porsche Boxster to life. Getting a 3D model this early into the design of a car was pretty unusual for the time. Usually you had to jump through a bunch of hoops, get the design past a board of directors, do a bunch of paperwork, and see what other people think of your idea before making a real 3D model. But because desperate times called for desperate measures, Porsche went ahead and let the Boxster's team make a 3D model. After hours of work on the clay, they made a perfect model, and after clay came wood. And with the final details hammered and chiseled out by hand, Larson and his team was ready to show the executives of Porsche their homework. The directors saw the model and immediately loved it. It was exactly what they were looking for. Immediately, the Porsche executives started looking for a place to show this new car off to the world. Initially, they planned to show their model off at the Geneva show in the spring of 1993, but they decided instead that they would show it in Detroit in January just to save as much time as possible, because they wanted this car to hit the roads as soon as possible. At this Detroit Motor Show, where this Porsche was first unveiled, the public loved it. As Porsche puts it, the Boxster received an overwhelmingly positive response from the public. They loved it. And because it received such a positive initial response, Porsche gave the green light to make the first driving model with one stipulation: build the concept exactly like that. So, just like that, they started development. And in March of 1993, just 2 months after the first wood model was shown, the design for the Boxster was finalized. Now, as is with the development of any car, they ran into some issues. One major one being the fitment of many of the components in the front of the car. As much as they wanted to keep the original design of the car, they couldn't. They had to change it a little bit. Some of these changes included lengthening the hood, but keeping the overall look of the car. And by the end of 1993, they had fixed all of the issues and settled on a final design. The final prototype was produced in early 1994 and testing ensued. They found the car to be exactly what they wanted in the way that it drove. And by the third quarter of 1995, the car started production. The result was a wonderful mid-engine sport car, weighing in at between 2,750 pounds and 2,900 pounds. It was powered by a 2.5-liter flat six, making 201 horsepower and 181 foot-pounds of torque. It generally feels a little bit underpowered, but the chassis has a ton of grip and handles really well. My friend actually just bought one of these, and I decided why not ask him a couple questions about how it drives. And his response was this: it's very planted and sticks to the ground like glue. It understeers more than it oversteers, and it's a little bit of a bumpy ride, but the seats are pretty comfortable and it's powerful enough to have fun. Interesting enough that he brought up the seats, because the interior is what I was going to get at next. Now, usually cars from this time period have terrible interior. Think of late 90s, early 2000s Chrysler. All of the interiors on all of the cars, yes, including the Viper, were the exact same. There was no variation between them, and it was just parts bin, classic interior. You just slap on anything and it would just work. Now, Porsche did exactly the opposite. Porsche spared no expense making the interior of this car feel classy and elegant, with leather seats that are supportive enough to handle some twisties, and yet still comfortable, and metal pieces of trim that were painted to the exact same color as the exterior of your car. When you step into this car, it just makes you feel sophisticated. My friend said, you have a similar experience to driving an MR2, but when you get out of an MR2, you feel like you just drove a fun car, not something classy and elegant. But when you get out of the Porsche, you feel like you're better than everybody else. You feel like you made the right choice, and you had a lot of fun doing it. So anyway, back to why you clicked on this video. How did this car save Porsche? Well, for one, it lowered production costs by over 30%, which allowed them to lower the price on the Boxster and therefore reach more people and sell more cars. Also, the Boxster was developed on the same chassis as the 911 and the Cayman, making the production costs shareable between all three of those cars. The Cayman being another car that played a huge role in saving Porsche. The Boxster also shared a pretty similar engine to the 911 of the same time, also lowering development costs. These bigger profits allowed for better, newer cars to be developed, including cars like the Cayenne that also helped save Porsche. So yes, through larger production numbers and lower production costs, the Boxster managed to save Porsche and make an incredible car while doing so. Such an incredible car will probably one day be a classic. But for now, you can pick them up for about 10 grand, which is a steal of a deal. They're really nice cars, and for somebody who has a little bit of money and is looking for a fun sidecar, or for somebody who's looking for a first car and is willing to put a couple grand into something like a fun, cheap sports car, the Boxster might be the perfect car for you. Porsche is actually still producing the Boxster today. They have 4 generations of the car, and a couple of variations of it, including the 3-door fastback like the Cayman, that races in the GT4 class today. If you want to learn more about the generations of the Boxster and all of the performance specs, stick around for the next video, because that's where we're going to cover all of the generations of the Boxster and cars such as the Cayman that sprouted from the Boxster. Thank you guys so much for watching, love ya, and catch you next time.